There's something fascinating happening with college romance adaptations right now, and I don't think Hollywood fully understands why audiences are responding to them the way they are. For years, the industry treated young adult romance like disposable streaming content. Quick emotional dopamine, attractive actors, viral clips for TikTok edits, and then everybody moves on a week later. But then projects started showing up that were trying to blend emotional intimacy with actual character psychology, instead of just giving viewers polished people staring at each other under neon dorm lights. And the moment the first trailer for Off Campus dropped online, you could immediately feel that difference. Not because it looked revolutionary. Honestly, the first thing I noticed was how restrained it was. That sounds strange for a romance trailer, because usually these things are cut like perfume commercials. Slow motion kisses, overexposed lighting, somebody running through rain, somebody else crying in a parking garage. Then a trending pop song kicks in right when the emotional hook lands. Studios almost always oversell chemistry before audiences have time to believe it naturally. But this trailer felt weirdly patient with itself. It trusted silence in a way most modern marketing doesn't anymore. The opening shot alone tells you exactly what kind of movie this wants to be. You've got this frozen winter campus atmosphere. Not cinematic winter, where snow looks magical, and every frame resembles a holiday card. I mean ugly northeastern college winter. Gray sidewalks. Students bundled up looking exhausted. Breath visible in the air. Fluorescent dorm lighting, making everything feel emotionally colder than it already is. And right away, the movie starts positioning college not as fantasy freedom, but as emotional pressure. That detail matters because a lot of romance films fail the moment they romanticize the setting more than the people inside it. Then you see the male lead for the first time, Garrett Graham, and the trailer avoids the obvious introduction. They don't frame him like a superhero walking into a stadium tunnel. He's already in motion, already distracted, already carrying emotional noise before he says a single word. That subtle decision changes the entire tone. It tells the audience this isn't just a popular hockey guy falls for girl setup. The movie understands Garrett's image is part of the problem. And honestly, that's why the source material connected with readers in the first place. The entire emotional foundation of this story depends on contradiction. Garrett looks like somebody who should never struggle socially, emotionally, psychologically. But underneath the confidence, there's this constant feeling that he's performing a version of masculinity expected from him. Athletes in college movies are usually simplified into categories: the arrogant guy, the loyal best friend, the aggressive rival. But the trailer keeps hinting at exhaustion beneath Garrett's charm. Tiny pauses, hesitation during conversations, the look on his face after jokes land. Those are actor-driven details, and whoever cut this trailer knew exactly which moments to hold on to. Then Hannah Wells enters the trailer, and the energy shifts completely. Not in a loud way. That's the interesting part. She doesn't arrive like the typical perfect girl changes his life. Cliché Hollywood keeps recycling. The trailer frames her as emotionally self-contained before it frames her as desirable. You notice her observing situations before speaking. You notice how carefully she guards herself socially. Even during lighter moments, there's restraint in her body language. And that's incredibly important because Hannah as a character only works if the audience understands she's actively protecting herself from vulnerability. The trailer actually understands trauma without turning it into spectacle. That's rare. There's a scene midway through the teaser where Hannah and Garrett are sitting on the floor of what looks like a music building practice room after hours. Nothing dramatic is happening. No crying. No screaming confession. She's talking quietly, while he listens instead of interrupting. And the camera stays wider than expected, almost uncomfortable in its distance. Most directors would push into close-ups there because they'd want maximum emotional manipulation. This film seems more interested in emotional observation. That choice gave me confidence immediately. Because romance lives or dies based on whether filmmakers understand listening, not attraction. Listening. You can fake chemistry with editing tricks. You can manufacture tension with music. But emotional intimacy on screen comes from whether characters genuinely appear affected by each other's presence. The trailer keeps emphasizing that idea over physical attraction. Even when the flirtation starts appearing, it's built around attention rather than seduction. And then there's the hockey angle. Now this is where I expected the movie to completely lose me, because sports romance adaptations usually become visually identical after a while. Slow motion ice spray, locker room yelling, emotional speeches about teamwork. But what surprised me here is that hockey almost feels like environmental stress instead of empowerment fantasy. The rink scenes are shot harshly, bright white lighting, loud impact sounds, heavy breathing. Garrett doesn't look liberated while playing. He looks trapped inside expectation. That's an incredibly smart tonal approach, because sports at elite college levels often become identity prisons for young athletes. The trailer quietly understands that dynamic without turning the story into some heavy sports drama. There's also a noticeable absence of artificial comedy, and I really appreciated that. Modern romance trailers are terrified of sincerity, so they overload everything with self-aware humor. Characters constantly undercut emotional scenes with sarcasm because studios are afraid audiences will cringe at vulnerability. But this trailer lets moments sit naturally. When Garrett says something stupid, it feels character-based instead of written for social media clips. One sequence especially stood out to me. There's this montage where Hannah starts tutoring Garrett academically, and the editing rhythm changes. Suddenly the movie feels warmer without announcing it directly. The lighting softens slightly. The soundtrack becomes less polished and more intimate. Tiny details start carrying emotional weight. Him watching her when she isn't paying attention, her slowly relaxing around him. Shared exhaustion during late night study sessions. That's where the trailer becomes genuinely effective, because it stops trying to sell plot and starts selling emotional progression. You begin believing these two people actually affect each other's emotional temperature. That's the entire game in romance storytelling. If audiences buy that, everything else works. If they don't, no amount of beautiful cinematography can save the film. What also impressed me is how carefully the trailer handles physical intimacy. It doesn't oversaturate the marketing with kisses or bedroom scenes. There are glimpses, sure, but they're fragmented emotionally rather than fetishized visually. The focus seems to stay on anticipation instead of payoff. That restraint reminds me of older romance filmmaking, where tension mattered more than immediate gratification. And honestly, that style is coming back because viewers are exhausted by algorithm-driven storytelling. People want emotional build-up again. You can feel it across television and film right now. Audiences are responding more to longing, awkwardness, emotional hesitation, the things human relationships actually feel like. The trailer for Off Campus leans heavily into that emotional uncertainty. Nobody looks fully emotionally safe here. Even the attractive people seem scared of themselves. That's real. There's another thing I noticed that most viewers probably won't consciously pick up during a first watch. The sound design is unusually grounded for this genre. Conversations overlap slightly. Campus environments sound busy instead of artificially muted. Footsteps echo realistically in dorm hallways. The movie seems determined to maintain physical realism even while telling an emotionally heightened story. That matters more than people realize. Romance becomes believable when environments feel lived in. One of the strongest shots in the trailer is absurdly simple. Garrett waiting outside a classroom while pretending not to wait outside a classroom. That's it. No dramatic dialogue. No swelling music. But the actor sells emotional vulnerability entirely through physical discomfort. He keeps checking his phone, looking away, adjusting posture, trying not to appear emotionally invested while obviously being emotionally invested. That scene alone probably convinced half the internet this adaptation might actually work, because awkwardness is attractive on screen when it feels authentic. And adaptation is the key word here, because book audiences are brutal now, especially with romance properties. Readers don't just want scenes recreated, they want emotional memory recreated. That's much harder. Anybody can replicate dialogue from a novel. Translating internal emotional experience into visual language is where most adaptations collapse. This trailer appears aware of that responsibility. Even the color palette tells a story. Early scenes feel colder, slightly desaturated, emotionally guarded. As Hannah and Garrett become more connected, warmer tones start quietly appearing in interiors. Not enough to feel stylized, just enough for your brain to register emotional change subconsciously. Good filmmakers understand viewers emotionally process color before dialogue. There's also this underlying loneliness running through the entire trailer that I didn't expect. Everybody looks surrounded by people, but emotionally isolated. Parties feel noisy rather than fun. Team gatherings feel performative. Dorm life feels claustrophobic instead of exciting. And that's honestly one of the most accurate portrayals of college emotional reality I've seen in marketing for this type of movie. The idea that thousands of students can exist in close proximity while feeling deeply disconnected from themselves. That emotional atmosphere gives the romance actual purpose. Because now these characters aren't just attracted to each other, they're recognizing each other. Huge difference. And when the trailer reaches its emotional crescendo, it wisely avoids revealing too much conflict detail. You get flashes of arguments, emotional distance, maybe family pressure, maybe past trauma resurfacing. But the marketing never explains everything explicitly. That confidence is refreshing because studios usually panic and reveal entire third acts inside trailers now. Instead, this teaser leaves emotional questions hanging. Can Garrett exist outside the version of himself everyone expects? Can Hannah trust somebody enough to stop emotionally retreating? Can two emotionally damaged people help each other without becoming emotionally dependent? That's heavier material than the marketing initially lets on, which is probably why the trailer exploded online the way it did. People weren't reacting only to attractiveness or romance fantasy. They were reacting to emotional recognition. The comments weren't just, they look cute together. People kept saying things like, this feels different, or this actually looks emotionally real, and that audience instinct is usually correct. You can fake excitement. You can't fake emotional identification. And by the final shot, Hannah looking at Garrett with this mixture of fear, affection, and disbelief, the trailer finally understands something most romance adaptations forget. Love stories are not about perfection. They're about emotional risk. That's what the best romance films capture. Not fantasy fulfillment, vulnerability, the terrifying possibility that another person might genuinely see you clearly. And for a couple minutes, this trailer manages to bottle that feeling surprisingly well. The more I sat with that trailer afterward, the more I realized the film is trying to position itself somewhere between modern streaming era romance and those older emotionally grounded character dramas from the late 90s and early 2000s that studios barely make anymore. You remember those movies where people actually talked like damaged human beings instead of walking Twitter captions? That energy is all over this thing. And honestly, it's risky because audiences today are weirdly split. Half the viewers want sincerity again, and the other half have been trained to mock sincerity on sight. So a movie like Off Campus has to navigate that balance carefully, or it becomes unintentionally corny. But the trailer keeps making one smart decision after another. It never begs the audience to think it's deep. That's important. A lot of young adult adaptations mistake trauma references for emotional depth. Characters mention anxiety once, somebody cries under colored lighting, there's a monologue about feeling broken, and suddenly the film thinks it earned psychological complexity. Real emotional storytelling doesn't announce itself like that. It emerges through behavior patterns, through avoidance, through silence, through people saying the wrong thing because they don't know how to say the right thing. This trailer understands behavioral storytelling. There's a moment where Garrett is clearly trying to flirt with Hannah during what looks like a campus party scene, and she responds with this tiny, skeptical smile that basically says, "I know exactly what type of guy you usually are." The interesting thing is, Garrett immediately adjusts his energy. He stops performing confidence and starts behaving more honestly. That single interaction explains their dynamic better than 3 pages of exposition ever could. You instantly understand why he's intrigued by her. She doesn't react to his social status the way everybody else does, and you understand why she slowly becomes interested in him too. Because underneath the polished athlete persona, she sees somebody exhausted by his own image. That mutual recognition is the backbone of every memorable romance film. Not attraction, recognition. People keep comparing this project to other college romance adaptations, but I actually think tonally, it's aiming closer to quieter relationship-driven films where emotional pacing matters more than plot mechanics. The trailer barely even explains the academic tutoring setup in detail because that's not really the point. The tutoring is just the excuse that forces 2 emotionally guarded people into proximity long enough for honesty to become unavoidable. And proximity is everything in stories like this. The trailer repeatedly traps these characters together physically. Empty classrooms, hallways after practice, library corners, late night walks across frozen campus pathways, shared rides, tiny apartments. The movie seems obsessed with emotional intimacy, created through accumulated ordinary moments instead of giant cinematic gestures. That's usually a sign filmmakers understand romance properly, because most real relationships aren't built through dramatic speeches. They're built through repetition, shared routines, tiny observations, comfort slowly replacing performance. One thing I found especially interesting is how carefully the trailer avoids glamorizing college culture itself. There are parties, sure, but they feel emotionally chaotic instead of aspirational. People are drunk, disconnected, loud in ways that feel emotionally compensatory rather than joyful. The camera often lingers on characters after conversations end instead of during the fun moments. That creates this strange emotional loneliness around the entire campus environment. And honestly, that's incredibly accurate for early adulthood, especially for students trying to become versions of themselves they haven't figured out yet. The soundtrack choice also deserves attention because whoever supervised the music clearly understood restraint. Instead of using massive, overproduced pop tracks, the trailer leans into softer indie instrumentation and ambient emotional textures. Songs drift into scenes rather than dominating them. That creates emotional continuity instead of forcing reactions. Music in romance trailers usually screams at viewers what they're supposed to feel. This one almost whispers. There's confidence in that approach. Then you start noticing the visual storytelling surrounding Hannah specifically, and it becomes obvious the film is deeply invested in her perspective emotionally. That's another thing adaptations often get wrong. They market the male lead heavily, because studios know internet fandom culture gravitates toward charismatic male characters, but then the female lead becomes emotionally reactive instead of psychologically developed. This trailer doesn't do that. Hannah feels like the emotional center of gravity. Even when Garrett dominates scenes socially, the emotional framing often stays connected to how she's processing him. The camera watches her noticing details about him. Moments when his confidence slips. Moments where his charm starts feeling genuine instead of strategic. You can practically see the movie charting her gradual decision to trust him against her own instincts. And trust is really the central theme here. Not romance, trust. The trailer keeps returning to emotional hesitation. Characters almost saying things, almost touching, almost confessing vulnerability. It understands that intimacy is terrifying for people who've spent years protecting themselves psychologically. Garrett hides insecurity behind charisma. Hannah hides emotional fear behind control and independence. The relationship works because both strategies eventually stop functioning around each other. There's one brief shot where Hannah is sitting alone after what looks like an argument, and the film doesn't frame the moment melodramatically. No dramatic rainstorm, no huge emotional collapse. She's just emotionally exhausted in a very believable way. That grounded emotional realism is what separates potentially memorable romance films from disposable content. Human beings rarely fall apart cinematically. Usually they just get quiet. The trailer seems aware of that. And then there's the chemistry issue, which is obviously the thing everybody was waiting to judge. Romance films can survive weak plots. They can survive predictable structure. They can survive cliches. They cannot survive empty chemistry. Audiences know immediately when two actors are manufacturing emotional connection instead of naturally generating it. What surprised me here is how much the chemistry seems built through comfort instead of intensity. That's harder to fake. Anybody can stare intensely at another actor for 10 seconds while dramatic music plays. But believable comfort on screen, shared rhythm, conversational timing, physical ease around each other, that requires actors genuinely understanding relational pacing. The trailer sells that beautifully, especially during quieter scenes. There's a section where Garrett and Hannah are joking during a study session, and neither actor appears overly polished. They interrupt each other naturally, smile at unexpected moments, lose eye contact occasionally. Tiny imperfections remain in the scene instead of being edited out. That human inconsistency makes the relationship feel alive. Honestly, it reminds me of older romance performances where actors were allowed to exist messily inside scenes instead of constantly maintaining aesthetic perfection. And I think audiences are starving for that again. Because social media already gives people polished beauty nonstop. What viewers miss emotionally is authenticity, imperfect pauses, emotional awkwardness, uncertainty. The trailer repeatedly prioritizes those textures over fantasy wish fulfillment. Even the physical cinematography supports that philosophy. The camera stays close enough to feel intimate, but rarely becomes overly stylized. Handheld movement appears occasionally during emotionally vulnerable conversations, creating slight instability in the frame. That subtle visual unease mirrors the emotional instability between characters. Good romance cinematography should feel psychologically connected to relationship dynamics, and this movie seems committed to that idea. Another thing worth mentioning is how carefully the trailer handles masculinity. This could have easily become another fantasy about a hyper-confident athlete rescuing an emotionally withdrawn girl through persistence. Hollywood has done that story 1,000 times. Instead, Garrett often looks emotionally confused by his own feelings. Vulnerability unsettles him. Hannah challenges his emotional shortcuts constantly. He doesn't save her emotionally. If anything, she forces him into self-awareness. That's a much healthier emotional framework. And viewers notice these things even subconsciously. Modern audiences are extremely sensitive to relationship dynamics now. They recognize manipulative behavior patterns immediately. They recognize emotional imbalance. The trailer seems intentionally designed to present mutual emotional growth rather than emotional dependency. That balance is difficult to maintain, especially in romance stories built around damaged characters. There's also this recurring visual motif involving isolation in crowded spaces that keeps appearing throughout the footage. Garrett surrounded by teammates, yet emotionally disconnected. Hannah at parties, looking mentally elsewhere. Characters sitting beside each other physically, while emotionally miles apart. The movie appears deeply interested in loneliness as a modern condition, rather than just a temporary emotional obstacle, which honestly gives the story more weight than I expected, because underneath the romance, the trailer is quietly talking about identity exhaustion, about young people performing versions of themselves to survive socially, about the terrifying relief of finally meeting somebody around whom performance becomes unnecessary. That's why certain moments in the teaser hit harder than expected, not because they're dramatic, because they're recognizable, and recognition creates emotional investment faster than spectacle ever will. By the time the trailer reaches its final emotional stretch, you can feel the filmmakers intentionally resisting the urge to oversell the narrative. They know audiences already understand the broad shape of a romance story structurally. Meet, resist, connect, break apart, reconcile emotionally. The real question is whether viewers care enough about the people involved to follow them through that structure. So instead of flooding the trailer with plot twists, the marketing leans into emotional atmosphere. Cold weather, sleepless nights, late conversations, suppressed attraction, fear disguised as sarcasm, hope disguised as indifference. That emotional texture is what made the teaser linger in people's minds long after it ended. Not spectacle, not shock value, emotional familiarity. And honestly, watching audience reactions online afterward became almost as interesting as the trailer itself, because you could immediately tell which viewers connected with the emotional realism versus which viewers only saw another college romance adaptation. The people who responded deeply weren't talking about plot points. They were talking about feelings, specific feelings. The anxiety of letting somebody get too close emotionally, the weird intimacy created during late night conversations, the loneliness of being surrounded by people who only understand your public version. That tells me the trailer accomplished exactly what it needed to accomplish. It didn't just advertise a movie, it reminded viewers of emotional experiences they already carry inside themselves. And that's really the moment when I started thinking this movie might end up mattering more culturally than people expect. Because romance stories only truly break through when they accidentally capture the emotional climate of a generation. Not the fashion, not the slang, the emotional climate. That invisible psychological atmosphere people are living inside collectively without fully realizing it yet. You look back at older romance films, and that's always what separated the forgettable ones from the lasting ones. The movies that endured weren't necessarily the most shocking or the most technically brilliant. They simply understood what loneliness felt like during a specific era. They understood how people communicated emotionally at that point in time. And when I watched the trailer for Off Campus again, I realized this film is tapping into a very modern kind of emotional exhaustion. Everybody in this trailer looks tired of pretending. That's the emotional fingerprint all over this thing. Garrett looks tired of performing confidence. Hannah looks tired of performing emotional independence. Even background characters feel emotionally disconnected in subtle ways. Conversations happening while people stare at phones. Loud parties where nobody actually seems present mentally. team environments built around image maintenance, social energy without emotional intimacy. That's modern college life in a nutshell, and the movie appears deeply aware of it. There's this brief shot during the second half of the trailer where Garrett is sitting in his car, alone at night, after what seems like a fight or emotional misunderstanding. No music, no dialogue, just dashboard light, hitting half his face while he stares forward, trying to process something emotionally bigger than he's equipped to handle. That image stuck with me because it's such an unglamorous portrayal of emotional confusion. Real emotional crises rarely look cinematic. Most of the time, they look exactly like that. A person sitting somewhere quietly trying to understand why another human being suddenly matters so much to them. The trailer also deserves credit for not turning Hannah into a fantasy archetype. She isn't framed as this impossibly quirky girl who magically transforms Garrett's worldview overnight. She's cautious, defensive sometimes, occasionally emotionally unfair. The marketing allows her flaws to exist visibly, which immediately makes the relationship feel more balanced. That's another thing audiences have become extremely sensitive to recently. People no longer want idealized perfection in romance stories because perfection feels emotionally dishonest now. We live in an era where everyone already curates idealized versions of themselves online constantly. Viewers respond more strongly to emotional imperfection because it feels rare. And honestly, the movie's decision to ground the relationship in conversation instead of spectacle might end up being its smartest creative choice. Think about how little genuine conversation exists in modern blockbusters now. Characters explain plot mechanics, deliver jokes, exchange exposition. But authentic conversational rhythm, people slowly revealing themselves through ordinary dialogue, has almost disappeared from mainstream filmmaking unless you're watching smaller independent dramas. This trailer suggests Off Campus is bringing that back. There are scenes where nothing important appears to be happening structurally, yet emotionally, everything is happening underneath the surface. Hannah and Garrett sitting on campus stairs talking about childhood memories, walking through snow while discussing music preferences, quiet teasing during study sessions that slowly evolves into emotional comfort. These moments matter because intimacy is cumulative. The movie seems to understand accumulation. That emotional closeness isn't built through giant declarations. It's built through repeated presence, repeated attention, repeated honesty. And honestly, that's probably why younger audiences connected with the source material so intensely in the first place. Beneath all the romance elements, the story taps into this universal desire to be understood beyond performance. Garrett spends his life being interpreted through reputation. Hannah spends hers hiding parts of herself emotionally to maintain control. Their relationship slowly dismantles both survival strategies. That's compelling drama because it's psychologically recognizable. One of the most revealing trailer moments happens during what looks like a minor argument. Garrett says something careless, probably trying to protect himself emotionally, and Hannah's reaction isn't explosive anger. It's disappointment, quiet disappointment. And his face changes instantly because he realizes he hurt somebody whose opinion genuinely matters to him. That emotional dynamic is incredibly mature for this genre. Most romance marketing relies on heightened emotional theatrics, shouting, running after somebody in airports, public declarations. This movie seems more interested in private emotional consequences, the damage caused by misunderstanding, the fear of vulnerability, the shame people feel after emotionally failing somebody they care about. That subtlety gives the trailer emotional credibility. Even visually, the film seems determined to avoid over-stylization. Dorm rooms look cluttered realistically. Campus buildings feel cold and institutional. Winter lighting remains harsh instead of romanticized. There's texture everywhere. Physical texture, emotional texture, environmental texture. Nothing feels artificially polished. And that imperfection actually becomes beautiful over time. I also think the hockey backdrop is functioning symbolically in a smarter way than people realize. On the surface, sure, it gives the movie energy and structure. Practices, games, pressure, competition. But emotionally, hockey represents a world where Garrett understands exactly how he's expected to behave. Aggressive, controlled, respected, productive. The rink is basically the one environment where he fully understands the rules. Hannah disrupts that emotional certainty. Around her, charisma stops solving problems. Image stops protecting him. And that's terrifying for somebody used to social control. Meanwhile, Hannah's emotional arc appears built around relinquishing control instead of gaining it. She survives through emotional caution, careful boundaries, predictability. Garrett introduces unpredictability into her life emotionally, which creates both attraction and fear simultaneously. That mutual destabilization is what gives the relationship dramatic tension. Not artificial misunderstandings, not love triangles, not exaggerated melodrama, just two people disrupting each other's emotional defense systems. And the trailer communicates that without needing heavy exposition. You feel it through pacing, through silence, through the way scenes are edited together emotionally rather than chronologically. Honestly, the editing might be the most underrated aspect of the entire trailer. The cuts aren't designed purely around momentum. They're designed around emotional progression. Notice how often the trailer juxtaposes isolation with connection. Garrett alone after a hockey game, immediately followed by Hannah laughing during a private conversation with him. Loud social scenes, followed by quiet emotional moments. Physical closeness, followed by emotional distance. The structure itself mirrors unstable intimacy. That's sophisticated marketing, especially for a genre studios often underestimate intellectually. And I think audiences are smarter than Hollywood sometimes gives them credit for. People can sense when filmmakers genuinely care about emotional truth versus when they're manufacturing algorithmic content. The response to this trailer felt organic because viewers recognize sincerity underneath the marketing, not perfection. Sincerity. There's a difference. A perfect trailer often feels emotionally empty because every frame is engineered too precisely. This trailer occasionally allows awkward pauses, uneven emotional rhythm, slight conversational messiness. Human inconsistencies remain visible. That humanity becomes attractive. Another thing that kept standing out to me during rewatches is how carefully the movie handles physical touch. There's tension in almost every interaction, but the camera doesn't fetishize contact. Small gestures carry enormous emotional weight because the characters themselves seem emotionally cautious. A hand lingering slightly too long. Shoulder contact during laughter. Sitting closer over time without acknowledging it consciously. That gradual escalation feels incredibly authentic. Real attraction often develops exactly like that. Not through immediate intensity, but through accumulated awareness. Accumulated comfort. Accumulated emotional dependency people don't notice forming until it already exists. And honestly, some of the strongest romantic moments in the trailer aren't even romantic on the surface. Garrett listening carefully while Hannah talks about something personal. Hannah noticing when he's emotionally off before anybody else does. Tiny examples of attention. That's what intimacy actually is. Attention. Undivided emotional attention. the trailer repeatedly frames that as more meaningful than attraction itself, which is probably why even viewers who normally don't care about romance movies started paying attention online. Because beneath the genre packaging, the emotional core feels universal. Everybody understands the experience of meeting somebody who slowly alters your internal emotional rhythm without permission. That feeling transcends genre. And then you reach the final montage section of the trailer, where the emotional stakes finally intensify. We get fragments of conflict, emotional withdrawal, hurt expressions, physical separation, Garrett looking emotionally panicked for the first time, Hannah appearing conflicted between self-protection and emotional openness. But even there, the trailer remains restrained. No giant melodramatic speech, no manipulative orchestral explosion, just emotional fracture. And honestly, that restraint probably made the ending hit harder than any dramatic climax could have. Because unresolved emotional tension lingers in the brain longer than resolution does. The trailer ends not with certainty, but with emotional vulnerability hanging unfinished in the air, which is exactly why people immediately started replaying it, not to understand the plot, to relive the feeling. And once a trailer makes people chase a feeling instead of information, that's usually the first sign a movie has genuine emotional staying power. Viewers replay spectacle to analyze details. They replay emotional truth because they're trying to sit inside the atmosphere again. That's a completely different type of engagement. And I honestly think the filmmakers understood from the beginning that this adaptation would live or die based on atmosphere, not plot. The plot itself is relatively familiar if you strip it down structurally. Two emotionally guarded college students collide unexpectedly. Attraction develops through proximity. Personal baggage complicates intimacy. Trust becomes difficult. Feelings intensify faster than either person anticipated. On paper, that framework exists in dozens of romance stories already, but emotional execution is everything. You can tell the same basic love story 1,000 different ways, depending on how honestly you observe human behavior. And this trailer feels deeply observant. That's the word I keep coming back to. Observant. It notices the awkwardness between emotional attraction and emotional fear. It notices how people joke when conversations become too vulnerable. It notices how somebody's entire posture changes around the person they secretly care about. Those details don't come from algorithmic screenwriting. They come from people paying attention to actual relationships. There's this tiny scene in the trailer where Garrett walks Hannah home after what appears to be a late-night study session, and neither of them wants the conversation to end, even though both are pretending otherwise. The dialogue itself isn't what matters there. It's the pacing, the hesitation before saying goodbye, the subtle slowing of footsteps, the way silence becomes charged instead of uncomfortable. That scene felt painfully real. Anybody who's ever developed feelings unexpectedly recognizes that emotional rhythm immediately. And I think that realism is what separates this project from the endless wave of interchangeable streaming romances audiences have been drowning in lately. So many of those films confuse aesthetic intimacy with emotional intimacy. They know how to light attractive actors beautifully. They know how to create Pinterest-worthy romantic imagery. But they don't understand emotional progression. This trailer understands progression. The relationship appears to evolve through tiny accumulated shifts rather than abrupt transformation. Garrett gradually stops performing social confidence around Hannah. Hannah gradually stops emotionally retreating every time vulnerability appears. Neither character changes instantly. The trailer keeps emphasizing process over fantasy. That's mature storytelling. And honestly, the emotional maturity surprised me because adaptations of popular romance novels often simplify complexity instead of preserving it. Studios tend to sand down emotional rough edges to maximize broad appeal. Characters become cleaner, safer, easier to market, but this trailer still allows discomfort to exist. Garrett occasionally seems selfish. Hannah occasionally seems emotionally unavailable. Miscommunication feels human instead of artificially constructed. Those imperfections are essential because romance only becomes compelling when both people feel emotionally capable of hurting each other unintentionally. Otherwise, there are no stakes. One thing I found especially interesting is how the trailer portrays social perception. Garrett exists inside this ecosystem where everybody thinks they already know who he is. Teammates, classmates, probably professors. Everyone interacts with the public version of him first. Hannah initially does too. But over time, she starts recognizing the exhaustion beneath the persona. That dynamic is incredibly relatable now because modern life has become so performative socially. Everybody curates versions of themselves constantly. Online, professionally, socially, emotionally. The idea of finding one person around whom performance becomes unnecessary is deeply appealing to audiences right now. I think that's why viewers responded so intensely to certain scenes in the trailer that are technically very simple. Two people talking honestly in quiet spaces suddenly feels radical in an era dominated by performative communication. And the movie seems very aware of that emotional hunger. You can feel it in the pacing. The trailer repeatedly slows down during moments where characters stop performing socially and start existing honestly. Those scenes breathe differently. The editing becomes less aggressive. Music softens. Ambient sound becomes more noticeable. The film itself appears emotionally calmer whenever Garrett and Hannah drop their defenses around each other. That's subtle filmmaking. Good romance direction often works psychologically like that. The audience unconsciously feels emotional safety before characters verbally acknowledge it. I also appreciate how carefully the trailer avoids over-sexualizing the relationship. Physical attraction obviously exists. These are attractive people, and the chemistry is undeniable. But the marketing never reduces intimacy to physicality alone. Emotional connection always seems foregrounded first. That matters because audiences have become exhausted by hollow sensuality in storytelling. People want emotional context again. They want to believe characters actually like each other as human beings. This trailer consistently sells companionship alongside attraction, and that combination is much rarer than studios realize. Some of the best moments are genuinely mundane. Shared food, studying together, casual teasing, walking across campus, sitting in silence comfortably. Those ordinary interactions create more believable romance than grand cinematic gestures ever could because ordinary life is where relationships actually exist. The trailer understands ordinary intimacy. That's why it feels emotionally convincing. And then there's the issue of tone, which the film seems to balance very carefully. Romance stories can become emotionally exhausting if they lean too heavily into trauma and seriousness, but they also become forgettable if everything feels weightless. This movie appears to sit somewhere beautifully in the middle. There's humor, but it emerges naturally from personality instead of forced comedic writing. There's emotional heaviness, but it never feels manipulative. That tonal balance is difficult, especially with younger characters. Hollywood often struggles to write college-age people realistically because scripts either infantilize them or suddenly make them speak like middle-aged philosophers. Here, the emotional intelligence feels age-appropriate. Garrett and Hannah are still figuring themselves out. They're emotionally reactive sometimes, defensive, contradictory, but underneath the confusion, there's sincerity. and sincerity is what gives the trailer emotional gravity. I keep thinking about one particular shot where Hannah looks at Garrett after he says something unexpectedly vulnerable. Nothing dramatic happens visually. She just realizes she may have misunderstood him emotionally. But the actress plays the moment with such subtle internal shift that you can literally see trust beginning to form. That's the type of acting romance films desperately need more of. Not exaggerated passion, recognition, internal emotional movement, tiny psychological changes visible in real time. Those details are what audiences remember subconsciously after movies end. And honestly, I think the winter setting contributes enormously to the emotional atmosphere too. Cold weather romances always carry a specific emotional texture because physical warmth becomes psychologically symbolic. Dorm rooms feel cozier. Shared jackets matter emotionally. Late night walks feel more intimate. Snow creates isolation and closeness simultaneously. The trailer uses winter beautifully, without turning it into aesthetic decoration. Campus environments feel emotionally cold before the relationship develops warmth gradually. That visual progression mirrors the emotional arc naturally. Again, subtle choices. But subtle choices are usually what separate memorable romance films from disposable content. There's also this fascinating undercurrent of fear running through the trailer. Not fear of external danger, fear of emotional exposure. Garrett seems genuinely unsettled by how much Hannah's opinion affects him. Hannah seems frightened by her growing dependence on somebody emotionally unpredictable. That fear makes the attraction believable, because meaningful intimacy is frightening, especially for people accustomed to protecting themselves psychologically. The trailer never forgets that vulnerability has consequences emotionally. Getting close to somebody means risking disappointment, misunderstanding, abandonment, loss of self-control. The film appears deeply interested in those emotional risks rather than just romantic fantasy fulfillment, which honestly gives the story more emotional credibility than I expected from the marketing. And maybe the smartest thing the trailer does is refusing to fully resolve emotional tension for the audience. Even by the end, you're not entirely certain whether these two people are emotionally good for each other or simply emotionally overwhelming for each other. The line between healing and emotional dependency remains intentionally blurry. That ambiguity is powerful because real relationships often feel exactly like that while you're inside them. You don't know immediately whether somebody is changing your life positively or simply changing it permanently. The trailer leaves viewers suspended inside that uncertainty, and that emotional suspension is exactly what made people keep talking about it afterward. Not because the movie looked perfect, not because it reinvented romance storytelling completely, but because it captured something emotionally recognizable about modern connection. The loneliness, the hesitation, the guardedness, the desperate hope hidden underneath all of it. And for a couple of minutes, the trailer made those feelings feel seen instead of exaggerated. What starts to stand out, especially after watching the trailer a few times, with that emotional texture in mind, is how deliberately the film seems to avoid the usual romance escalation shortcuts that Hollywood relies on. You know the patterns: sudden jealousy arcs, forced misunderstandings, dramatic interruptions right before confessions, love triangles inserted just to stretch tension. None of that feels like the engine here. If anything, the tension in off-campus seems to come from something much quieter and harder to manufacture: emotional timing. People don't fall in love at the same speed, and the trailer keeps emphasizing that imbalance. Garrett looks like someone who catches feelings fast, but tries to slow himself down out of pride. Hannah feels like someone who understands her feelings early, but refuses to act on them because emotional caution is her default survival mode. Curious. That mismatch alone creates a kind of invisible friction between them in every shared scene. Even when they're smiling, there's a sense that one of them is slightly ahead emotionally, while the other is still catching up. That's real relationship pacing, honestly. Rarely do two people develop feelings in perfect sync. One always risks more first, and the trailer quietly builds entire scenes around that imbalance without ever pointing it out directly. You can see it in how conversations end awkwardly sometimes, not because something goes wrong, but because one person isn't ready to extend the moment while the other clearly wants it to continue. That tiny asymmetry becomes emotional tension. Another thing that becomes clearer on repeated viewing is how much the film seems interested in emotional aftermath rather than emotional peak moments. Most romance trailers highlight the big scenes, the kiss, the confession, the breakup, the reunion. But here, the lingering moments after emotional events feel more important than the events themselves. Characters are often shown processing what just happened instead of performing what's happening. That shift matters because emotional truth doesn't live in peak moments. It lives in what people do afterward when they're alone again. There's a quiet scene in the trailer where Hannah is sitting in her dorm room after what looks like an emotionally charged interaction, just staring at nothing for a while before finally moving again. No dialogue, no dramatic score, just internal processing. And that's one of the most psychologically accurate depictions of early romantic confusion I've seen in a mainstream romance trailer in a long time. People don't immediately articulate feelings in real life. They replay them internally, over and over, trying to understand what they meant, trying to understand what they should have said, trying to predict what the other person is now thinking. That internal loop is where most emotional development actually happens, and the trailer respects that space instead of skipping over it. I also keep coming back to the way Garrett's public identity is slowly shown to be both an advantage and a prison. On the surface, being the well-known athlete gives him confidence, structure, belonging. But the trailer keeps hinting that this identity comes with emotional cost. He's expected to be a certain version of himself constantly. Strong, controlled, likable, uncomplicated. But Hannah doesn't respond to that version of him. And that destabilizes everything. Because suddenly Garrett has to ask a question he probably hasn't asked in years. If I stop performing this identity, do people still stay close to me? That's a quietly terrifying question for someone in his position. Meanwhile, Hannah's emotional structure feels built around the opposite problem. She isn't performing a public identity as much as she is managing emotional access. She controls how much of herself people get to see, not because she's deceptive, but because openness has consequences for her. Vulnerability isn't casual for her. It's selective, intentional, guarded. So when Garrett starts breaking through that barrier, it doesn't just create attraction, it creates emotional instability. Because her system isn't designed for that level of access. That's where the relationship gains real narrative weight. Not from external obstacles, but internal resistance systems colliding. And that's a much more interesting kind of romance conflict than most mainstream films attempt. There's also a subtle visual idea running through the trailer that I didn't fully notice at first, but becomes more obvious the more you pay attention. Garrett is often framed in open spaces, rinks, large rooms, wide campus shots, while Hannah is frequently framed in enclosed or semi-enclosed spaces, dorm rooms, libraries, smaller corners of campus. But as the relationship develops, those visual patterns begin to overlap. They start appearing in each other's spaces more naturally. It's almost like the film is visually mapping emotional integration. Two separate worlds, slowly occupying the same emotional geography. That's thoughtful cinematography if it holds throughout the film. Another layer worth pointing out is how the trailer handles masculinity without turning it into a lecture. Garrett isn't portrayed as toxic or villainous in a simplified way. Instead, he's shown as emotionally constrained by expectation. His confidence is real, but so is his emotional limitation. He knows how to function in competitive environments, but not necessarily how to sit inside emotional uncertainty without trying to control it. And Hannah disrupts that instinct, not by fixing him, but by refusing to engage with performance. That distinction is important because it keeps the relationship grounded in mutual change rather than one-sided transformation. She doesn't exist to heal him. He doesn't exist to liberate her. They both shift because proximity makes emotional avoidance harder to maintain. That's a much healthier emotional structure for a romance narrative. The trailer also continues to avoid making humor feel like a separate layer from emotion. In a lot of modern romance marketing, humor is inserted as relief, a way to break tension artificially. But here, humor often emerges from emotional discomfort itself. Nervous jokes, unexpected sarcasm during vulnerable moments, small laughter during tension that doesn't fully resolve anything but slightly diffuses it. That's how people actually behave when emotions get too intense to process directly. They deflect, they joke. They soften the moment without fully escaping it. And the film seems to understand that instinct. Even the pacing of dialogue suggests that conversations are allowed to breathe awkwardly. People interrupt each other sometimes, pause too long before responding, look away mid-thought. These imperfections make the interactions feel less like scripted exchanges and more like observed behavior. That observational quality keeps coming up again and again. And I think that's the key reason this trailer feels different from generic college romance content. It doesn't feel constructed purely for emotional effect. It feels watched. Like someone actually paid attention to how people behave when they're trying not to fall in love, while slowly doing exactly that. By the end of the trailer's emotional sequence, what lingers isn't the question of what will happen plot-wise, but whether these two people can actually sustain emotional openness once it begins. Because attraction is easy compared to vulnerability maintenance. Initial connection is not the difficult part. Staying emotionally available when discomfort starts is where most relationships fail. And the trailer seems to understand that deeply. So instead of promising a perfect romance, it promises emotional uncertainty that feels honest. And that honesty is probably why people keep replaying it, not for answers, but for recognition. What's interesting at this point is how the trailer slowly stops feeling like it's selling a romance and starts feeling like it's documenting a psychological shift between two people who don't fully understand what's happening to them yet. That's a subtle but important transition in how it presents off campus. Because the early impression is attraction, but the lasting impression is change. And change is always more unsettling than attraction. There's a moment in the trailer where Garrett is shown alone in a space that feels unusually quiet for him, almost like the world has temporarily stopped rewarding his usual social behavior. No teammates around him, no crowd energy, no external validation, just him sitting with his own thoughts. The framing makes it feel slightly uncomfortable, like he's not used to existing without being perceived in a certain way. That's a powerful visual idea when you think about it. Some people are so used to external identity reinforcement that solitude becomes disorienting. And Hannah seems to trigger that exact kind of disorientation in him, because around her, he can't rely on reflexive social performance. The trailer keeps suggesting that his usual strategies, humor, confidence, reputation, don't function the same way in private emotional spaces. and that forces him into something much more vulnerable: self-awareness without audience validation. That's where a lot of the emotional tension quietly lives. Meanwhile, Hannah's internal struggle operates in the opposite direction. Her emotional system appears designed to maintain stability through distance. She doesn't avoid connection entirely, but she regulates it carefully. And Garrett disrupts that regulation not by forcing his way in, but by consistently staying present in ways she isn't fully prepared for emotionally. Presence becomes pressure, not aggressive pressure, just consistent emotional availability that starts to break down her defenses over time. And that's actually more psychologically realistic than dramatic romantic pursuit narratives. Real emotional walls don't usually collapse from one big moment. They erode through repetition, through familiarity, through repeated safe exposure to something that initially felt risky. The trailer seems to understand that erosion process very well. There's also a growing sense in the footage that both characters are slightly afraid of what they're becoming around each other. Garrett starts acting less controlled socially. Hannah starts acting less guarded emotionally. Neither of those changes is fully comfortable for them. Growth, in this context, doesn't feel purely positive. It feels destabilizing. That's an important tonal choice, because real emotional development rarely feels clean while it's happening. It often feels like losing control before it feels like healing. One of the quieter but most revealing aspects of the trailer is how often characters seem caught in half-thoughts. Conversations don't always finish cleanly. Emotional statements aren't fully articulated. There are pauses where something meaningful almost gets said but doesn't quite arrive. Those unfinished emotional sentences create a sense of suspended communication. And suspended communication is basically the emotional language of early intimacy. You're constantly on the edge of saying too much or not enough, trying to calibrate honesty without risking rejection. That tension lives in almost every interaction between Garrett and Hannah in the trailer, and it's why the relationship feels believable even in brief fragments. Another thing that becomes clearer is how the film seems to treat vulnerability as a skill neither character has fully mastered yet. Garrett's vulnerability comes out inconsistently, sometimes through frustration, sometimes through accidental honesty. Hannah's vulnerability appears controlled, delayed, and carefully rationed. Neither of them is emotionally fluent in openness at the start, so the relationship becomes a kind of unintentional emotional education, not in a romanticized fix-each-other way, but in a trial-and-error way, where both people gradually learn what it means to be emotionally available without immediately retreating afterward. That's a much more grounded approach to character development, and it's one of the reasons the trailer feels less like fantasy and more like emotional observation. There's also a strong undercurrent of identity confusion running beneath everything. Garrett isn't just dealing with attraction, he's dealing with the possibility that his current identity might not fully contain who he is emotionally becoming. Hannah similarly begins to realize that emotional control might not be as stable as she believed once real connection enters her life. That kind of identity instability is a hallmark of transitional life phases like college. People often underestimate how destabilizing early adulthood relationships can be. They don't just add emotional experience, they reshape self-perception. And the trailer subtly reflects that psychological reality rather than simplifying it into romantic fantasy. Visually, that idea is reinforced through shifting spatial dynamics again. The more emotionally connected the characters become, the less rigid their environments feel in relation to each other. Scenes begin to blend emotional worlds rather than separating them strictly into his space and her space. That merging of environments mirrors emotional merging. And emotional merging is always slightly disorienting at first. even positive connection feels like losing something familiar. That's why some of the trailer's most effective moments are not romantic in a traditional sense, but transitional. Moments where characters are no longer who they were, but not yet who they are becoming. That in-between space is where the story really lives, and the trailer seems most interested in that psychological threshold rather than endpoint romance satisfaction, which is honestly a more sophisticated way to frame a love story, because the ending of romance stories is often less interesting than the transformation required to reach it. By the time the trailer moves toward its final emotional impressions, what stays with you isn't just chemistry or conflict, but the feeling of two people slowly destabilizing each other's emotional certainty in ways that feel both uncomfortable and necessary. And that's probably why audiences aren't reacting to it like a standard college romance preview. They're reacting to it like something emotionally familiar, but rarely articulated so clearly on screen. Not because it reinvents the genre, but because it observes it more carefully than expected. At this point in the trailer, something subtle shifts again, and it's not even about the romance anymore. It's about control. Because both Garrett and Hannah start losing control over the very systems they built their lives on, and the film doesn't frame that loss as chaos in a dramatic sense, but as something quiet and internal, almost like emotional gravity slowly changing direction inside them. For Garrett, control used to look like certainty. He knows how to perform in public spaces. He knows how to stay composed under pressure. He knows how to turn attention into advantage. But the trailer keeps showing small cracks where that control doesn't translate into emotional situations with Hannah. Around her, he can't predict outcomes the same way. Conversations don't follow his usual rhythm. Emotional responses don't match his expectations. And that unpredictability starts affecting him in ways he clearly doesn't fully understand yet. You can see it in the way he pauses before speaking more often, in the way he stops trying to dominate conversations, in the way confidence starts turning into hesitation at the edges, not weakness, just uncertainty entering a space that used to feel automatic. Meanwhile, Hannah's version of control is even more internal. Hers is about containment, emotional containment. She doesn't let situations escalate emotionally unless she chooses to. She regulates distance. She regulates access. She regulates how much of herself exists in any given interaction. But Garrett disrupts that containment without forcing anything. That's what makes it complicated, because he's not breaking her boundaries aggressively. He's just consistently existing close enough that her emotional system has to keep recalibrating. And recalibration takes energy. The trailer starts to reflect that exhaustion in her too. Not in overt breakdowns, but in small moments where her emotional guard feels slightly delayed. A reaction that comes half a second later than it used to. A pause before she answers something that would have been automatic earlier. That delay is where emotional change actually lives. It's almost invisible unless you're paying attention. But once you notice it, you realize the entire relationship is being built in those micro delays. And that's what makes this adaptation feel more psychologically aware than typical college romance storytelling, because it understands that emotional transformation doesn't announce itself. It sneaks in through timing. There's also a growing sense in the trailer that both characters are becoming emotionally unfamiliar to themselves. Garrett starts reacting in ways that don't match his established identity. Hannah starts experiencing emotional responses that don't align with her usual self-protection strategies, and neither of them has a framework yet for what that means. So instead of labeling it love immediately, the trailer presents it as disruption. And disruption is more honest at this stage, because early emotional connection often feels less like romance and more like internal instability you can't fully explain. Another detail that stands out is how the film treats distance. Physical distance between them starts shrinking gradually across scenes, but emotional distance doesn't always follow the same pattern. Sometimes they're physically close but emotionally uncertain. Other times they're separated but emotionally preoccupied with each other. That mismatch becomes part of the tension. And that's a very real dynamic in early relationships. Proximity doesn't guarantee clarity. It often increases confusion. The trailer also keeps emphasizing how other people react to them differently once their dynamic starts forming. Teammates notice changes in Garrett's focus. Friends notice Hannah withdrawing or re-engaging socially in uneven patterns. The outside world becomes aware of something shifting, even if it doesn't fully understand what that shift is. That external awareness adds pressure, because now the relationship isn't just private anymore. It's socially visible in fragments. And once something becomes socially visible, it stops belonging only to the two people inside it. That's a pressure most romance stories underplay, but this trailer hints at it constantly. There's also a very interesting emotional contrast between moments of connection and moments of separation. When they're together, there's warmth but also emotional tension, like neither of them fully trusts the stability of the moment. When they're apart, there's reflection but also emotional pull, like absence makes the connection louder rather than weaker. That push-pull dynamic becomes the emotional engine. Not external obstacles, internal oscillation. And that oscillation is what makes the relationship feel unstable in a believable way. One of the more understated things the trailer does well is how it uses silence not just for intimacy, but for emotional contradiction. Two characters sitting together quietly can feel both comforting and tense, depending on what just happened before that moment. The silence is never neutral. It always carries emotional residue. That's a very specific kind of storytelling awareness. Because silence in real life is never empty during emotional situations. It's always loaded with what hasn't been said yet. And this trailer seems very conscious of that fact. By the time we reach the later montage sequences, there's a noticeable emotional layering happening. Earlier moments feel simpler in comparison. Attraction, curiosity, initial tension. Later moments feel heavier because now there's memory attached. History building between them. Emotional context accumulating in every glance. That accumulation is what starts turning the relationship into something irreversible. Not because anything dramatic necessarily happens, but because shared emotional history changes how people perceive each other permanently. Once you've seen someone vulnerable, you don't fully go back to seeing them the same way again. And the trailer leans into that idea heavily. Even shots that appear simple on the surface carry that weight once you understand the emotional context building underneath them. A glance is no longer just a glance. A pause is no longer just hesitation. A conversation is no longer just interaction. Everything becomes layered. And that layering is what makes the relationship feel lived in, even in short trailer fragments. There's also a recurring sense that both characters are slowly becoming emotionally dependent on moments they don't yet want to admit matter to them. That dependency doesn't feel unhealthy in the trailer, it feels inevitable, like emotional closeness naturally producing attachment, whether or not either person is ready for it. And that inevitability is what gives the story its forward momentum. Because once emotional attachment starts forming, ignoring it becomes harder than acknowledging it. The trailer never explicitly says that out loud, but it shows it through behavior, through repetition, through return, through emotional revisiting of each other, even when they try not to. And that's really where the trailer lands emotionally. Not in the idea of a perfect romance forming, but in the slow realization that emotional connection, once started, doesn't stay contained within intention. It expands, it complicates, and it changes both people involved in ways neither of them fully consented to in advance. What starts becoming clearer now is that the trailer isn't just telling a romance story. It's quietly building a story about emotional identity shifting under pressure. Because by this point, both Garrett and Hannah are no longer behaving like fixed characters. They're starting to behave like people whose internal logic is being rewritten by experience. And that's a very specific kind of storytelling shift that you usually only see when filmmakers are thinking in psychological terms rather than purely narrative ones. With Garrett, the most noticeable change is that his confidence stops feeling like a constant trait and starts feeling like something he has to actively reconstruct in certain moments. Around teammates, it still works. Around social environments, it still holds. But around Hannah, it becomes inconsistent. Sometimes it appears, sometimes it falters. Sometimes it arrives too late to protect him emotionally from the situation he's already in. Pause. That delay is important because confidence that arrives late stops functioning as identity and starts functioning as defense. And defenses only activate when something feels emotionally threatening. So even without explicitly saying it, the trailer starts suggesting that Hannah represents an emotional space where Garrett's usual identity isn't stable enough to rely on. Meanwhile, Hannah's emotional structure starts showing the opposite kind of shift. Her control doesn't disappear, but it becomes less absolute. It begins to compete with emotional instinct. There are moments where she clearly reacts emotionally before she decides how she should react. And that gap between instinct and control becomes increasingly visible as the trailer progresses. That gap is where vulnerability enters, not through choice, but through delay in regulation. And what makes this interesting is that neither character is being forced into change by external events in a traditional plot sense. Instead, change is happening because proximity itself is functioning as pressure. The more time they spend in each other's orbit, the more their emotional systems begin to adapt, whether they intend to or not. That's a very organic way to build romantic tension. It doesn't rely on plot escalation. It relies on emotional exposure over time. There's also a noticeable shift in how the trailer frames communication between them. Early interactions are straightforward. Questions, responses, playful tension. But later interactions start becoming layered. People say one thing while meaning something slightly different. Conversations carry subtext more than direct meaning. Emotional intent becomes harder to separate from spoken words. And that's exactly how real intimacy complicates communication. Once feelings exist, language stops being neutral. Everything carries implication. Everything carries interpretation. The trailer leans into that ambiguity more and more as it progresses. Another detail that stands out is how both characters begin reacting not just to each other, but to their own reactions. Garrett notices when he cares too much. Hannah notices when she softens too quickly. And those moments of self-awareness create secondary emotional tension inside scenes that would otherwise feel simple. It's like they're both observing themselves becoming different people in real time. That kind of internal witnessing is psychologically heavy because it forces characters to question whether they are choosing feelings or simply experiencing them. And the trailer never answers that question directly, which is exactly the right choice. There's also an increasing sense that external environments are becoming less emotionally relevant compared to internal states. Early on, campus life, social events, and sports environments all feel significant. But as the emotional connection deepens, those external spaces start fading into the background of emotional importance. What matters more is how they feel around each other than where they are. That shift is subtle, but it's important because it shows the story narrowing from world building into emotional focus, and that narrowing is what usually signals that a romance narrative is transitioning from setup into irreversible emotional involvement. One of the more powerful recurring ideas in the trailer is the way both characters start associating specific emotional safety with each other's presence. Not in a dramatic, "you are my safe place" way, but in a quieter behavioral way. One person's presence reduces emotional tension in the other, without either of them consciously deciding that's happening. That's how attachment actually begins forming in most real relationships, through regulation, through calm, through repeated experiences of emotional relief. The trailer seems very aware of that psychological mechanism, and it uses it to slowly shift the emotional tone of scenes without explicitly announcing anything. Even moments of conflict feel different because of this underlying attachment. Arguments don't feel like separations. They feel like interruptions in something already emotionally established. There's an expectation of return, even when distance appears. That expectation changes everything because it removes finality from conflict. It turns emotional distance into a temporary state instead of a conclusion. And that's what makes the relationship feel increasingly irreversible as the trailer continues. Another interesting layer is how memory starts becoming part of the emotional structure. Earlier scenes feel self-contained. Later scenes feel like they're referencing emotional history between the characters, even if the viewer only sees fragments of it. You can sense that something has already happened between them before certain shots, even if it isn't explicitly shown in the trailer. That's a sign of strong editing structure, because it suggests continuity of emotional experience rather than isolated moments. And romance stories thrive on continuity more than anything else. There's also a quiet shift in how physical space is used. Initially, space separates them. Different rooms, different environments, different social circles. But gradually, space becomes shared more frequently. Not always comfortably, but increasingly naturally. And that increasing overlap creates emotional pressure simply by proximity repetition. At a certain point, repeated proximity stops feeling like coincidence and starts feeling like emotional inevitability. And that's where attachment becomes difficult to resist. The trailer also keeps returning to the idea that neither character fully understands what the relationship is becoming while it's happening. They are inside the emotional process, not outside observing it. That lack of external clarity makes everything feel more immediate and slightly disorienting, because emotional transformation is rarely recognized in real time. It's usually understood afterward, when distance finally gives perspective, and the trailer intentionally avoids giving that perspective too early, which keeps the emotional experience immersive instead of analytical. By this stage, what the trailer has successfully built is not just anticipation for a romance outcome, but a sense of emotional trajectory that feels both natural and slightly uncontrollable. You don't feel like you're watching two people decide to fall in love. You feel like you're watching two people realize, too late to fully stop it, that something between them has already changed shape permanently. And that realization, quiet, gradual, and irreversible, is what carries the trailer into its final emotional impression. At this point, the trailer's emotional language starts doing something even more subtle. It begins to imply consequences without ever clearly defining what those consequences are. That's a very specific storytelling technique, and it works because the audience's imagination fills in the gaps faster than exposition ever could. In Off Campus, you start sensing that whatever is forming between Garrett and Hannah isn't just a private emotional experience anymore. It's starting to have ripple effects, not dramatic ones, social ones, psychological ones. the kind of consequences that don't announce themselves immediately, but slowly reshape how people move through their environment. You can feel that shift in how other characters begin reacting to them in fragments. Not full scenes, just glances, interrupted conversations, changes in group dynamics. It's the kind of storytelling that suggests a larger ecosystem exists outside the romance, even when the trailer is focused tightly on the two leads. And that matters because it prevents the relationship from feeling isolated from reality. College life, especially in a setting like this, is socially interconnected. Relationships don't exist in a vacuum. They affect friendships, reputations, routines, even academic behavior. The trailer hints at that web without fully mapping it out, which keeps the emotional focus tight while still acknowledging the world around them. What becomes especially interesting is how Garrett's identity starts to fracture slightly in public perception versus private behavior. In public, he still performs the expected version of himself. But in private moments with Hannah, that version becomes less consistent, and those two versions begin to feel like they're competing for dominance rather than coexisting smoothly. That internal split creates tension that doesn't need external conflict to exist, because identity conflict is already enough. Meanwhile, Hannah's transformation is even quieter, but arguably more significant. She doesn't become louder or more expressive in a traditional sense. Instead, she becomes less predictably guarded in specific emotional contexts. And that unpredictability is what signals change more than anything else. When a controlled person becomes slightly less controlled in selective moments, it means something has already shifted internally. And the trailer understands that without explaining it. Another thing that stands out in this section of the footage is how emotional escalation is handled through interruption rather than climax. Instead of building toward big emotional payoffs, the trailer often builds toward moments that feel like they should become something larger, but don't fully resolve. A conversation almost turns into a confession. A moment almost becomes a decision. A glance almost becomes a turning point. That almost structure is doing a lot of emotional work, because it mirrors how real emotional development often feels from the inside. Not clean transitions, but near transitions. Moments where something shifts internally, but hasn't yet been acted on externally. And that gap between internal change and external expression is where most of the tension lives in this story. There's also a growing emotional weight in how silence is used between them. Early silence felt comfortable or neutral. Later, silence feels loaded with awareness. Both characters seem more conscious of what silence means now. It's no longer empty space, it's interpreted space. And interpretation always adds pressure. Because once silence becomes meaningful, it stops being neutral ground. It becomes communication without words. The trailer also begins to emphasize emotional timing differences more heavily. One character is often emotionally ready before the other. That imbalance creates moments where connection could happen, but doesn't fully land because both people aren't in the same emotional place at the same time. And that misalignment is one of the most realistic sources of tension in relationships. It's not that feelings don't exist, it's that they don't arrive evenly. That unevenness creates hesitation, confusion, and emotional second-guessing. And the trailer builds entire scenes around that subtle imbalance rather than external obstacles. Another important layer is how trust starts becoming less of a feeling and more of a decision. Early on, trust seems to form naturally through comfort. But later in the trailer, trust feels like something both characters actively risk rather than passively experience. They have to choose it in moments where uncertainty is present. and choosing trust is always more complicated than feeling trust. Because choice implies awareness of risk. That awareness creates emotional weight in even small interactions. There's also a noticeable shift in how physical closeness is framed. At first, closeness feels like attraction. Later, it feels like emotional vulnerability. And eventually, it starts feeling like emotional exposure, like being seen in ways that can't be easily undone. That progression is important because it mirrors how intimacy actually deepens over time, not through dramatic escalation, but through changing interpretation of proximity. The same distance between two people can feel completely different emotionally, depending on context and history. The trailer keeps subtly recontextualizing space between them in that way. Another detail that becomes clearer is how much the story is about emotional risk tolerance. Garrett seems to have a higher tolerance for initiating connection, but lower tolerance for emotional uncertainty once connection deepens. Hannah seems to have the opposite. Lower tolerance for initiating connection, but higher tolerance for sustained emotional ambiguity. That difference creates a very specific kind of relational tension, because one person moves toward connection faster. The other holds it more carefully once it exists. And that difference shapes the entire emotional rhythm of their interactions. The trailer doesn't label this dynamic explicitly, but it structures scenes around it consistently. There's also a quiet but persistent idea that both characters are slowly becoming emotionally changed in ways they didn't plan for and can't fully reverse. And that realization starts to appear in their behavior even before it's acknowledged internally. They hesitate more. They overthink more. They react slightly differently than they used to. Those micro adjustments signal internal transformation long before narrative acknowledgement arrives. And that's what makes the emotional arc feel continuous instead of segmented. By the time the trailer moves toward its final emotional impression, what's left isn't a sense of resolution or even anticipation for resolution. It's more like awareness that something irreversible has already started, and the only remaining question is how it will settle. Not whether it will happen, but what shape it will eventually take once it fully exists in their lives. And that's where the trailer leaves the viewer, inside that unresolved emotional space where connection is no longer theoretical, but not yet fully defined either. At this stage, the trailer starts to feel less like it's building toward a romantic payoff and more like it's showing the slow loss of emotional neutrality between two people. That might sound subtle, but it's actually one of the biggest shifts in how stories like Off-Campus work when they're handled with restraint. Because once neutrality disappears, everything changes. Every interaction becomes meaningful. Every pause carries weight. Every absence is interpreted instead of ignored. And you can see that happening in the way Garrett and Hannah begin reacting to each other, even when they're not directly interacting. Earlier in the trailer, they only exist emotionally when they're in the same scene. But later, it feels like each one is constantly aware of the other, even in separate moments. That kind of emotional continuity is important because it shows attachment forming beyond immediate proximity. It's no longer just interaction-based connection. It becomes cognitive presence. One person starts occupying the other person's thoughts, even in silence. And the trailer never needs to say that outright. It shows it through pacing, reaction timing, and emotional residue left in scenes after separation. Another thing that becomes more obvious in this final stretch is how both characters start losing emotional predictability. Early on, you can almost anticipate how they will respond in certain situations based on their established traits. Garrett reacts with confidence masking uncertainty. Hannah reacts with control masking vulnerability, but as the trailer progresses, those patterns start breaking down. Garrett reacts emotionally instead of strategically. Hannah reacts instinctively instead of deliberately, and that unpredictability signals that both of them are no longer fully operating within their original emotional frameworks. That's a major character shift. Because when people stop behaving according to their own established patterns, it usually means something deeper has started to rewire their internal responses. And the trailer captures that rewire process in very small, almost invisible ways. A pause that's slightly too long, a glance that lingers slightly too much, a response that doesn't match previous behavior. Those micro changes accumulate into a sense that both characters are evolving in real time. Another important layer is how emotional responsibility starts becoming shared, even without explicit agreement. At first, each character is responsible for their own emotional boundaries and reactions, but gradually, they start responding to each other's emotional states more carefully, almost instinctively. If one pulls back, the other notices. If one softens, the other adjusts. If one hesitates, the other recalibrates. That creates a kind of emotional feedback loop between them, and once that loop is established, it becomes self-sustaining. Neither person fully controls it anymore. That's where attachment becomes structurally embedded rather than situational. The trailer also begins to emphasize emotional memory more heavily in its final sequences. Earlier interactions feel like isolated moments, but later scenes carry echoes of previous interactions inside them. A look between them now feels informed by earlier tension. A quiet moment feels shaped by something that happened before it. That layering of emotional history is what makes relationships feel real on screen. Because no interaction exists in isolation once emotional history exists. Everything becomes cumulative. And the trailer leans into that accumulation instead of resetting emotional states between scenes. Another subtle but important detail is how both characters begin to show emotional anticipation. Not just reaction, but anticipation of each other's emotional responses. Garrett starts expecting certain reactions from Hannah. Hannah starts anticipating Garrett's emotional shifts before they fully happen. That anticipation is a form of emotional intimacy itself, because it means both people are beginning to internalize each other's behavioral patterns, and that internalization is one of the strongest indicators of emotional bonding. The trailer never states it directly, but it shows it in how conversations flow differently over time. Less explanation, more understanding, less clarification, more assumption of emotional familiarity. There's also a growing emotional weight in what is not being said between them. Earlier silence felt like space. Later silence feels like withheld communication. And eventually, silence becomes a kind of shared emotional awareness that both characters are actively navigating. That transformation of silence is one of the most important emotional markers in the trailer, because silence shifts from absence to presence, from nothing happening to something happening internally. Another key aspect is how the trailer starts blurring the line between emotional conflict and emotional intimacy. Early on, conflict feels separate from connection, but later, even tense moments feel connected to emotional closeness. Arguments don't fully break the emotional bond. They test it, stretch it, and sometimes even strengthen it. That blurring is significant because it reflects how real relationships often function. Conflict isn't always separation. Sometimes it's clarification. Sometimes it's pressure testing emotional boundaries. And sometimes it's just two people struggling to communicate depth accurately. The trailer begins to show that complexity more clearly as it progresses. Another thing worth noting is how both characters start to emotionally return to each other even after distance. Physical separation doesn't fully reset emotional engagement anymore. Instead, it seems to intensify it. Absence becomes active rather than passive. And that's one of the clearest signs of attachment formation. When distance increases emotional awareness instead of reducing it. The trailer subtly reinforces that through repeated visual structure, cutting between separated characters thinking about or reacting emotionally to shared experiences. Even when they are apart, they are no longer emotionally apart. And by the end of this section of the trailer, what becomes most apparent is that the relationship is no longer being shaped by attraction or curiosity alone. It is now being shaped by emotional persistence, a continuous presence in each other's internal world that doesn't fade when scenes end. And that persistence is what pushes the trailer into its final emotional space, where connection is no longer a possibility being explored, but a condition already forming and slowly becoming impossible to ignore.